Okay, hello everyone. The script that I'm going to be narrating in this video is based largely on an essay that I wrote while a master's student in cognitive neuroscience at the CUNY Grad Center. The name of the class was Consciousness, and it was co-taught by two pioneers of the field, a neuroscientist, Dr. Tony Rowe, and a philosopher, a Dr. Richard Brown. In naming the essay that I'm about to narrate, I certainly did not shy away from the dramatic. I titled it A Eulogy for the Ghost in the Machine, on the loss of minimal self in schizophrenia. Although a bit histrionic, I don't think that it's an entirely bad title. The metaphor of the ghost in the machine describes in only 4 words why consciousness feels like a hard problem for scientific reduction, if not an impossible problem. Because the ghost, or whatever you want to call it, consciousness, mind, spirit, feels as though it were at once non-physical and that indivisible container of all experience. As such, without this non-physical container, it would seem as though there can be no awareness at all, no contents inside the container. But what if this apparent structure of experience were actually an illusion? What if the machine could run on its own while the ghost went on vacation or even died altogether? And what would happen to a certain psychiatric patient who experiences such a death? How would this change the structure of the patient's conscious experience? In this essay, I tried to advertise the relevance of a schizophrenic psychopathology known as the loss of minimal self to consciousness research, actually to a specific theory within consciousness research. The theory is the Attention-Schema theory, or AST for short, and it is associated with its founder, Dr. Michael Graziano, a neuroscientist at Princeton University. Attention-Schema theory is an illusionist theory of consciousness, and the theory that I personally find to be the one that is most persuasive. However, I argue that Graziano's theory lacks a strong clinical case to support it. In a nutshell, Graziano argues that the apparent non-physicality of conscious experience results from data that presents itself as not being data. If this is the case, there should be some psychiatric condition that corresponds with an instance of this deceptive bit of data being either deleted or decontextualized from first-order states of consciousness. My argument is that self-disturbance in early or prodromal schizophrenia describes this decontextualization very well. It is perhaps the clinical case that Dr. Graziano is looking for. Finally, while this essay was originally written for people interested in consciousness research, I mean my class on consciousness, I think that the connection offered here has real value for clinical psychiatrists as well. Indeed, I've been in contact with one such person, Dr. Barnaby Nelson at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Nelson has conducted research that explores the clinical significance of self-disturbance in early-stage schizophrenia as a predictor of disease progression towards frank psychosis and hallucination. I am encouraged by Dr. Nelson's research insofar as it pushes back against the objectivist bias present in much of clinical psychiatry. He not only sheds a light on the inward experience or phenomenology of patients on the schizotypal spectrum, but also tests whether this phenomenology has real causal relevance towards other, perhaps more easily quantifiable symptoms. To researchers such as Dr. Nelson, I argue to you that it is worth your time to consider the framework of Dr. Graziano's attention-schema theory, even if you are, understandably, dissuaded by relatively esoteric discussions on consciousness. I hope to show you that AST provides a framework for linking two aspects of schizophrenia in its earlier prodromal stages. More specifically, AST helps us to relate the phenomenology of self-disturbance or loss of minimal self with observed deficits in social cognition and the key fact that social isolation is known to be a risk factor for schizophrenia progression. So, without further ado, I will begin reading from my adapted essay. Before I do this though, please note that I plan to release a narration both as a video and as an audio-only podcast. The video will include helpful graphics for those who are new to consciousness research. However, these graphics are not really essential, and the audio-only version is perhaps ideal for busy professionals who are already well versed in matters such as the so-called hard problem of consciousness. Section 1. Goals. The broad goal of this paper is to relate a family of clinical literature with a specific view on the hard problem of consciousness. The clinical literature pertains to a phenomenological characteristic of schizophrenia, a loss of minimal self or ipseity, also sometimes referred to as self-disturbance, which occurs during the early or prodromal stages of the disease. On the other hand, the specific view on the hard problem of consciousness is provided by Michael Graziano's attention-schema theory, hereafter AST. Graziano posits that there is a difference between access and phenomenal consciousness, insofar as subjects are sometimes able to attend to a stimulus without reporting awareness of said stimulus. However, he makes a radical claim that the extra stuff corresponding to phenomenal consciousness may simply result from access to a distinct chunk of data, let's call it phenomenal or P-consciousness data, whereas access or A-consciousness data corresponds to the contents of consciousness, let's say the specific sensation, emotion, or thought running through one's mind. P or phenomenal consciousness data describes the general state of being phenomenally aware. Needless to say, Graziano's position is contentious. In the first place, it is relatively uncontroversial to posit that the contents of conscious experience are encoded in discrete bits of neuronal data. This much is accepted by philosophers such as David Chalmers, who calls this problem of reducing the contents of conscious experience to physical causation the so-called easy problem of consciousness. Here, easy is not meant to imply trivial, but rather possible. This is to contrast it with the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is to reduce the particulars of pure experience, let's say the experience of greenness, to some physical explanation. The problem is not just hard, but it's considered to be impossible. Indeed, philosophers such as Thomas Nagel argue that there is simply no way that we can explain subjective experience, qualia, in terms of the neural machinery inside of our brains. The case for the irreducibility of experience was most famously argued by Nagel himself in his seminal essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? In Nagel's view, neuroscientists can delineate material correlates of a bat's echolocational system, but these correlates will never get at how bats actually experience echolocational calls. Think about this for yourself. Regardless of how much we learn about the physical mechanisms behind echolocation, we will never know whether a bat experiences a given echolocational signal as a kind of color, sound, or other experience that we simply cannot fathom because we don't have access to it. On these points, I propose a kind of pragmatic solution. First, I ask the reader to consider whether Nagel's threshold for describing experience is needlessly high. We may never know everything of what it is like to be a bat, or for that matter, a human being other than ourselves. However, I argue that we can still glean something of what it is like to be a human using scientific description. For example, I think we can agree that humans experience sound volume quantitatively, like less or more, and light wave frequency qualitative, right? So red is not more than blue. Red is qualitatively different from blue. Once again, this broad statement is not meant to capture the totality of sensory experience or what it is like to be deaf or what it is like to experience blue as a Russian versus English speaker. I only mean to point out there might be certain aspects of what it is like to be a human that are relatively self-evident. Extending from this, neuroscience has tangible value to the study of human experience. For example, understanding the multiple stages of parallel inhibition in the neural system dedicated to color processing helps to explain our qualitative and not quantitative experience of color. In simpler terms, research in visual neuroscience has helped in revealing why we experience red as different from blue and not, once again, somehow more or less than blue. Granted, Graziano does not make this compromise himself. Instead, he argues that the whole shebang can be explained in material terms. For Graziano, the ethereal and physically irreducible feeling of consciousness is exactly that, a feeling. Consciousness results from a deceptive bit of data that when read out says, I am not data. At this juncture, I think it makes sense to pause and take stock of a few things. First and foremost, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the many theories of consciousness that exist, you should note that Graziano's staunchly physicalist stance puts him in the so-called illusionist camp. This sets him against philosophers who argue that consciousness is inherently non-physical and therefore immune to any scientific or physical reduction. And, critically, it also sets him against neuroscientists who agree with philosophers on the non-physical nature of consciousness, but argue that this non-physical thing can be shown to somehow result or arise from neuronal machinery. Prominent figures in this camp include figures like Giulio Tononi, a neuroscientist known for the Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. Another member of this camp is perhaps Francis Crick, a British scientist best known for his role in deciphering the structure of DNA, but who has, in more recent decades, popularized quantum theories of consciousness. Once again, Graziano is against these theories insofar as they attempt to account for something non-physical in physical terms. At least that's Graziano's argument. This is, to him, a fool's errand, and to hammer this point, he asks us to consider how our subjective report of being conscious must result from an information processing cascade beginning with some data, encoded perhaps in a neuronal ensemble, and ending with the motor neurons controlling our mouths. In other words, the most plausible explanation for why we report to be conscious is because the information processing cascade has accessed some bit of data that describes a feeling or state of non-physical awareness, and we can call that bit of data consciousness data for now. So, yes, Graziano is essentially saying that we are machines who claim to be conscious, and yes, that is actually the title of his 2019 article in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. As underwhelming as this might all sound, Graziano's rebuttal is that any theory positing a non-physical substance affecting something physical is essentially a magical theory and not a scientific one. And I am sympathetic to Graziano insofar as competing theories such as IIT and quantum theories seem to be on a kind of wild goose chase for complexity. The presupposition made by these opposing theories seems to be that consciousness is very complex and mysterious, and that we humans are likewise complex and certainly not deluded, and that we will therefore find the colloquial key to consciousness in some analogously complex system in the physical universe. Very conveniently in a system that we do not fully understand ourselves, such as quantum mechanics or complex recurrent networks. According to Graziano, these theories don't actually explain the how of how something physical can result in something non-physical or vice versa. And personally, I find the suggestion that consciousness must exist in that super complex thingy to smack of a kind of anthropocentrism that led us to believe in previous centuries that we are ontologically distinct from monkeys, or that our planet Earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa. Okay, but maybe you're still not convinced by all of this. Maybe you are depressed by Graziano's staunchly physicalist stance and its nihilistic implications. Or maybe you just feel disillusioned from the seemingly irreconcilable quagmires of consciousness research. Well, if this is the case, then I have some good news for you. Basically, my main point in this video is to propose an interesting connection with schizophrenia. The purpose is not to defend Graziano's theory or to answer the end-all be-all mystery of consciousness. Indeed, Dr. Graziano has many interviews available on YouTube, and you will find better explanations of the theory from the man himself. So, hearkening back to my previous compromise, you may yourself find that Graziano's physicalist framework does not explain the complete phenomenal characteristics, the something that it is likeness of consciousness. But I will try to convince you that his physicalist framework helps at least explain certain tacit and constant aspects of our experience of what it is like to be a human being. Tacit aspects that are perhaps disrupted in the schizophrenic psychopathology of self-disturbance. I hope this will encourage the listener to consider ASC for what it has to offer. So with this in mind, we will begin with the question, how might our subjective report of consciousness result from information processing? Section 2, the structure of phenomenal consciousness and AST. Let's first take stock of the subjective report. We humans report not only to be conscious of certain things, but also to be phenomenally aware. This phenomenal awareness feels real and yet non-physical. Furthermore, consciousness feels embodied in our heads, which results in the strange feeling that the non-physical yet real thing is essence-like or even halo-like. Finally, consciousness feels like a unified whole, an indivisible container of experience. Indeed, some might point to the unified nature of conscious experience as a means of pushing back against physicalist theories such as AST. After all, how could the unified whole correspond to discrete bits of data? But the correct response, I think, is to ask why not? Why couldn't you have one discrete bit of data, of information, that describes a constant and undying unity of experience? Likewise, consciousness feels non-physical, but this most likely results from physical data that describes a non-physical experience. To return to Graziano's own words, it might result from a deceptive bit of data that says, I am not data, when read out. Generally, we should not assume that our cognitive representations present veridical versions of things in the physical universe. Our brain is a product of evolution, and its purpose is to aid in survival and reproduction. In this way, cognitive representations may correlate with things in the physical universe, but only insofar as these correlations increase fitness. To provide a more concrete example of this, consider color. There is nothing like red or green in the physical universe. To be clear, our cognitive representation of color does correlate with something in the physical universe, and that's wavelength spectra. But you will be a very disappointed physicist if you try to find blue in the universe. Graziano's main point is that consciousness is a representation and therefore essentially analogous to color. But this begs the question, what is consciousness a representation of? Graziano's answer to this question is very compelling in my opinion, and the answer is what sets attention-schema theory, AST, apart from other illusionist or physicalist theories of consciousness. In a nutshell, Graziano proposes that consciousness is an internal model of attention. Attention, like light spectra, is a real physical thing. It is a process by which some neuronal signals win out over others in our brains. For example, in a crowded cocktail party, only some voices win out over others in your auditory cortex, and you can generally only keep up with one conversation at a time. So why would our brains build an internal model or schema of attention? What evolutionary benefit is afforded by this representation? With color, the answer seems relatively straightforward. Color helps us to label objects in the real world, such as fruits. With the attention schema, Graziano argues, the use is revealed in both social and personal contexts. In other words, our brains create a schematic model of attention when we attempt to decode not only our own attentional states, but also the attention of others. The evolutionary benefit of this is immense. If we are able to track the attentional states of others, then we are better able to cooperate. For example, imagine how difficult cooperative hunting would have been for our early ancestors were they unable to spontaneously intuit the attentional states of others in the group. Of course, we humans do not have direct access to the real physical substrate of attention, that is, neuronal competition. But we use the available information, like eye gaze, to construct a working model. Let me give you an example. In the jealous girlfriend meme, you immediately understand that the boyfriend's attention is directed towards the woman in the red dress. This understanding results from an immediate and perception-like representation similar to color. Indeed, the representation is analogous to self-consciousness insofar as it comprises the same key elements that we mentioned before. In the first place, you can't help but feel as though there is some real, albeit non-physical essence somehow embodied in the boyfriend's head, his consciousness, that's directed towards the woman in the red dress. Finally, you perceive his consciousness as a singular whole, an awareness, not an awareness is. At this point, you might respond that this sounds all a bit kooky and that you, a bona fide rationalist, perceive no such essence awareness. But to this, Graziano might argue that the process is once again perception-like. Just as your intellectual understanding of light spectra does not prevent you from seeing the color red, your intellectual understanding of attention does not prevent you from intuiting a kind of essence-like awareness while passively viewing human or even animal faces. And this social connection has manifold significance, especially for our impending discussion on schizophrenia. In the first place, it strengthens AST insofar as it provides an evolutionarily sound explanation for why humans model attention as something real, albeit immaterial. Once again, tracking others' attentional states has direct evolutionary benefit, and since we cannot actually peer into the brains of others, our brains schematize these attentional dynamics as a real, albeit non-physical essence. Furthermore, considering consciousness in the domain of social interaction helps us to appreciate something that is sometimes overlooked. More specifically, we intuit that this non-physical essence awareness is the cause of human action. In other words, we immediately feel as though the boyfriend is looking at the woman because he turned on his own volition. In other words, that he has free will. However, if we perceive no essence-like awareness in the boyfriend's head, then our explanation for why the boyfriend turned would be purely mechanical. In other words, the explanation would totally lack any concept of free will or agency. I should note that this last point, relating the essence-like form of the attention schema with time, action, and agency, is not something that is deeply explored by Graziano, at least in the one book that I read, and I could be wrong, maybe I skipped the critical pages. Either way, it's something of my own suggestion or extension, but I certainly think it is worth considering. For example, it resonates with how very young children, of sometimes only 8 months old, intuit that inanimate objects are moved passively by external forces such as the wind, but that animate objects are moved by themselves. Finally, if perception of awareness essence precedes agency, then this could explain a key benefit that the attention schema affords to the individual. Namely, it permits the individual to perceive of themselves as agentic. We can appreciate this insofar as higher level beliefs in free will may promote persistence, as shown by the psychologist Jonathan Schooler at the University of Santa Barbara. However, at a lower and more visceral level, the benefit of feeling agentic is perhaps revealed by patients who report a kind of crisis of the will. As we will see, such a crisis of the will is included in the phenomenology of schizophrenic self-disturbance for many patients in the prodromal period. Ultimately, if our modeling of attention as a kind of essence awareness precedes our perception of agency in the world, then, were this modeling to fail due to neurological disorder, the patient would suffer a profound destruction in the extent to which they perceive agency in themselves and others. The argument that I will make in due time is that schizophrenic self-disturbance fits this chain of events very well. Indeed, in early stage schizophrenia, we observe discordant and faulty information processing. This might account for why, in such patients, the attention schema is either not constructed or not effectively contextualized to self and other. Furthermore, extending from this framework, or the framework of AST, this decontextualization would result in a host of different symptoms, such as a deficit in the ability to intuit the attentional states of others, once again a certain crisis of the will or agency, and, most ineffable of all, the feeling that one is no longer phenomenally aware in the normal sense. Or, to return to the analogy present in the title of my essay, that there's perhaps no longer a ghost in the machine. That might describe the state of no longer being phenomenally aware in the normal sense. We're going to cover this in more detail soon. Ultimately, if the listener is a supporter of AST, I hope to convince her that schizophrenic self-disturbance encompasses the likely symptoms resulting from a fault in attention schema processing. However, if you are such an AST supporter or even an AST founder, then you may or may not buy my argument that schizophrenic self-disturbance is the strongest clinical model of a decontextualized and therefore defective attention schema. But either way, I do think that my proposal at least helps to address a problem in AST. The problem is that biological systems such as the brain are messy. Deletions and disruptions happen. If the perceived non-materiality of phenomenal awareness results from access to information that describes this state, then there should at least be some clinical case corresponding with this deletion. As far as clinical cases go, Graziano offers a few in his 2013 book, Consciousness and the Social Brain. However, I did not find these cases to be very strong. For example, he discusses the out-of-body illusion frequently in the first few chapters. This illusion is useful insofar as it demonstrates how embodiedness, a normally tacit and constant aspect of conscious experience, is actually dissociable and therefore likely governed by a discrete bit of datum. However, while this helps to illustrate how the perceived unity of conscious experience is perhaps illusory, it doesn't provide a clinical case of what happens when other key bits of datum are deleted. Specifically, that key bit of datum that describes a certain non-physical essence like awareness. At different points of the book, at later points in the book, Graziano points to a syndrome known as Attentional-Neglect as a supporting clinical case. In this condition, patients report being unaware of visual stimuli in part of their visual field. For example, maybe in just the left side of my visual field or just the right side. But follow-up assessments indicate that the patient possesses some knowledge of the object, even if they report that they are unaware. The patient might say that they're just guessing, but their guessing is usually significantly above chance, which once again indicates that the patient possesses some knowledge of the visual stimuli in the affected visual field. So, for those who believe that phenomenal consciousness is truly separate from information processing, then this neglect syndrome might present a means of distinguishing object level or access level consciousness from phenomenal awareness. The idea here is that the patient's processing is intact at the access level, albeit impaired at the phenomenal level, hence the report of not being aware. However, AST and other illusionist theories do not, in the first place, presuppose that the phenomenal qualities of consciousness arise from a genuinely phenomenal and non-material system. Once again, it arises from data that quote-unquote presents itself as not being data. Given this, I hope you can see how neglect is not perhaps the best clinical case to support AST. The deficits, in my opinion, are too absolute. We should not be looking for patients with a total absence of experience, but instead for patients who remain aware of things in their world, but lack the feeling that their awareness has a unified, embodied, and even non-material quality. More generally, if there is one thing that I took from Graziano's theory, and that I hope to impart to the listener, it is how the thing we seek to explain in any scientific theory of consciousness is the fact that we humans report certain dimensions of experience. But we certainly should not look for said dimensions in the physical universe. For example, the linchpin, in my opinion, of Graziano's theory is that humans report phenomenal awareness. But it would be a fool's errand to look for some non-material correlate of phenomenal consciousness in the physical universe. By far the most plausible answer is that the report of non-physical awareness results, once again, from access to a bit of neuronal data that describes something non-physical. This is analogous to how it would be a fool's errand to look for something like the color blue in the physical universe. Extending from this, I would point out to Dr. Graziano and other proponents of AST that consciousness also presents itself to us as a kind of indivisible whole. I think this expectation is even ingrained in the very word, consciousness, which implies a kind of singular and end-all be-all entity. This has very real, important ramifications for theories of consciousness. It means that a theory is immediately judged to be good, or at least plausible, if it finds or at least searches for a kind of physical switch for that analogously singular entity consciousness. But what if the perceived unity of consciousness were itself the byproduct of a discrete bit of neuronal data? Well, we could ask the question, what if this discrete bit of neuronal data were deleted or dissociated from other first-order states of consciousness, such as specific perceptions and thoughts. The result, I think, would not be a total absence of experience, but a strangeness or a kind of bizarreness of experience. In what follows, I will describe patient accounts that describe exactly such a strangeness of first-person experience. But my point here is that because we experience consciousness as an indivisible entity, we are naturally inclined to view conditions such as clinical neglect, in which there is a binary switch between awareness and non-aware states, as highly relevant to consciousness research. Likewise, it predisposes us to see the odd, varied, and sometimes bizarre accounts of schizophrenic patients as irrelevant. This is because these patient accounts seem to describe a profound change in the structure of conscious experience and not an absence of it. However, this bias results from us confusing the experience with the real thing, in my opinion. Just because we experience consciousness as a whole and container-like entity does not mean that our research should focus on thingy consciousness states or their supposed physical correlates. Section 3. How would a defect in attention schema processing present itself to us clinically? So now we can finally ask this question. Well, since the schema, according to Graziano, permits humans to decode the attentional states of others in a fast and reflexive manner, we would certainly expect deficits in social cognition. At the very least, decoding the actions of others would become less automatic and more deliberate. What is less straightforward, however, is how this disruption would affect the patient's inward experience or phenomenology. According to AST, the bits of data encompassing the schema, for example, the bit that describes a non-physical state, attach themselves to the first-order objects of awareness as a sort of higher-order metadata. What results is that our brains encode at least two distinct families of information during normal conscious experience. For example, while viewing an apple, the first family of data would account for the first-order states. More specifically, these states would describe the apple and its qualities, for example, its red color. The second family of data is the metadata associated with the attention schema. It is what makes us not only see the apple, but also feel conscious of it, and also more generally feel conscious. The metadata, in Graziano's words, accounts for why we are machines who report awareness. Existing without this metadata, therefore, might result in a sort of zombie-like existence. While first-order mental states persist, there would be an uncanny feeling that there is no longer an aware I who's doing the perceiving, thinking, feeling, etc. In summary, if this essence information data accounts for the ghost in the machine phenomenology, then loss of this information might result in something like the persistence of the machine following the death of a ghost. I anticipate that the reader might disapprove of the use of metaphor in the above paragraph and in my own title. And the reader might find this language to be perhaps dangerously unempirical, etc. However, language is not a variable that we can set aside while considering the quandary of consciousness. More specifically, we cannot assume that the loss of essence information data would be easily communicable. Indeed, AST supposes that the attention schema is, like color, a pre-reflexive experience. As such, the experience is prior to language, and we cannot assume that language contains words to describe its absence. Furthermore, insofar as a minority of people might have experienced this loss throughout human history, we cannot assume that this minority would have influenced language in any major way, especially if, as will be shown to be the case for schizophrenia, this minority is predisposed to social isolation. Therefore, we should be receptive to metaphorical language, as metaphor provides a means to overcome the poverty of concepts afforded by single words. Section 4. The loss of minimal self in schizophrenia. Now we can finally turn to the aforementioned patient accounts. The following accounts are taken from Louis Sass's Summary of Self-Disturbance in Prodromal or Early Schizophrenia, in his chapter in the Oxford Handbook of the Self. Dr. Sass is a philosopher at Rutgers University who certainly deserves recognition as one of the first figures to shed attention on the inward experiences associated with schizophrenia. Please note that I'm abridging these patient accounts to be the length of about a sentence each. 1. lacking the sense of truly existing as a vital center point of experience. 2. I am void. 3. Lack of inner nucleus. 4. Feel his body to be a mere thing. 5. Felt like a physical object. 6. Having thoughts as opposed to being thoughts. 7. Feel ontologically different from other people. Quotes 1 through 3 captured a core phenomenology of self-disturbance. There is a fundamental change in the first-person perspective accompanying all experience, and two things are really worth explicating here. In the first place, because the word self is sometimes associated with a higher-level concept of self, like self-identity, the term self-disturbance belies the fundamental and visceral nature of the disorder. Indeed, the disorder does not attack the self as object of thought, for example, one's personality or narrative identity. It instead attacks the constant and tacit feeling of being as oneself the subject of one's own experiences. Indeed, the very sense of the self as subject. The feeling is so primitive that it is almost impossible to comprehend its absence, even with the aid of metaphor in the above patient accounts. The second point is that on face value, this disorder lines up extremely well with an AST framework. First-order mental states persist. For example, the patient continues to understand that apples are red and see red apples. But the higher-order metadata describing the meta-state, my awareness, for example, while seeing a red apple, is apparently lost. The phenomenology of lost self-essence attached to the first-order states is furthermore suggested by quotes 2 through 5. Like the out-of-body illusion, the essence of one's awareness is sometimes disembodied. In all cases, there is a persistence of first-order states while the readout of the metadata is disrupted in one of variable ways. In a nutshell, this is like seeing without the normal sense of being. According to Louis Sass, a frequent complaint among patients is the very inexplicability of the experience. This is consistent with the notion that language simply does not contain the vocabulary to describe the loss of consciousness metadata. Nonetheless, clinicians have, in recent years, attempted to devise more systematic measures of abnormal self-experience associated with self-disturbance. More specifically, they have created the EASE, or Examination of Anomalous Self-Experience Scale. By assessing high-risk patients over time using this scale, clinicians such as Dr. Barnaby Nelson at the University of Melbourne have found that these changes in inward experience are predictive of disease progression towards frank psychosis. As such, Dr. Nelson's research helps to show that self-disturbance is a very real clinical variable with very real significance. In the previous few minutes, I argued that self-disturbance is consistent with AST. First-order mental states persist, but the tacit constituents of higher-order experience, the consciousness metadata, are disrupted. However, I do not want to give the impression that first-order information processing is left undisturbed. In contrast, there is a profound disorganization in the structure of access-level cognition. In other words, a profound disorganization in the manner by which specific percepts and thoughts and feelings, the very contents of consciousness, enter and exit one's mind. So, do these first-order deficits stymie the extent to which we can view schizophrenic self-disturbance as exclusively some kind of disorder of consciousness? Well, we must first and foremost remind ourselves that, according to the logic of AST, there's really no mechanistic difference between first-order mental states and higher-order phenomenal qualia or states. Just like the contents of consciousness itself, the phenomenal attributes of consciousness also result from information. Therefore, it is completely sensible that this information, the attention-schema metadata attached to all experience, is not immune to global deficits in information processing experienced by schizophrenic patients. This would indeed be the predicted outcome under AST. In very simple terms, the phenomenology of self-disturbance might result from a failure to bind first-order states, such as the perception of an apple, with the higher-order data describing the state of being phenomenally aware. Or, to use terminology familiar to schizophrenia researchers, self-disturbance may result from a source monitoring error wherein first-order objects of recognition are decontextualized from the metadata that describes these objects as occurring within the non-physical, embodied, and self-owned stage that is awareness. Although the metadata is usually experienced implicitly, the patient may suffer from an experience reminiscent of aberrant salience or hyperreflexivity, in which the consciousness data is accessed more explicitly as a finite part of information and not as the ethereal backdrop or stage of awareness. In brief, global deficits in source monitoring error and aberrant salience could bring about the death of the illusion of consciousness. So far, the point has been to show that self-disturbance is consistent with the foundational argument of AST, that phenomenal consciousness results from information. However, this argument is not necessarily unique to AST. It is found in other physicalist accounts of consciousness as well. What makes AST unique is its emphasis on the so-called social connection. The hypothesis is that consciousness data not only distinguishes aware from access states, but it furthermore allows humans to model other people's attentional states in a fast and perception-like manner. This is because, once again, consciousness data describes a model or schema of attention, and we use this schema to model the attention of ourselves and others. Therefore, we can ask if schizophrenic patients exhibit the predicted deficits in social cognition. The simple answer is that schizophrenic patients do indeed exhibit the expected deficits in social cognition, that is, more specifically in mentalization. Here, please note that concepts like mentalization or theory of mind mechanism all refer to the ability of human beings to instinctively read the mental states of others during social interaction. It is this facet of social interaction that likely most depends on our ability to construct an attention schema. Critically, schizophrenics likely do not exhibit deficits in other aspects of social cognition, such as emotion sharing. The deficit is therefore likely constrained to mentalization. This deficit is even more minutely constrained to reflexive or automatic mentalization, as patients might exhibit some ability to solve theory of mind tasks through explicit deliberative thinking. In sum, schizophrenic patients are specifically impaired in their ability to model the mental states of others in a fast and perception-like manner. This is entirely consistent with AST, and I will recapitulate my hypothesis that the observed social deficits emanate from an inability to reflexively model the attention states of others using the attention schema, and that this inability is itself a byproduct of more global deficits in the organization and binding of information. In closing, we must consider how social isolation is perhaps a prime risk factor for schizophrenia in the early or prodromal stages. This is a really key piece of information, and it helps to tie together a few important ideas. First, let us recall one of the core elements of Graziano's argument, that the attention schema arises in two contexts. First, it arises in the context of self-awareness. This form of the attention schema explains the apparent non-materiality of one's own awareness. Second, it arises in the context of social interaction. This form permits us to rapidly mind-read other people using only their eye gaze, and it furthermore explains why we intuit a non-physical substance, a mind, that causes people to act in an agentic and non-mechanical way. Between the two, the first form, corresponding with self-consciousness, would seem less incidental and more constant in all experience and therefore more important. However, if the attention schema is truly analogous to a kind of perception, then perhaps both forms present an important opportunity for training, as in perhaps social interaction represents a kind of gymnasium for the fast and reflexive modeling of attention. If we are experts at doing it with others, perhaps we can more effortlessly apply the same perception, the same model back to ourselves, back to our own awareness. Indeed, such a rationale would track with the use it or lose it principle that is ingrained in much of our cognitive hardware. For example, congenitally blind children who undergo cataract surgery in adulthood often remain severely vision impaired. The idea is that the brain, specifically the visual cortex, was deprived of the expected input during the period of optimal plasticity in early childhood. And just like vision, social interaction is no less of an expected input for the human brain. As such, if the human brain is deprived of social interaction, perhaps the same use it or lose it principle applies. And the deprived brain can no longer model attention effectively in both social and self contexts. Ultimately, although the problem may have originated in the context of social interaction or a lack thereof, the destruction of the attention schema in the self context is perhaps more profound, more constant, and more debilitating. Hence, why clinicians refer to the problem as one of self-disturbance. Still, this hypothesis provides a means for relating self-disturbance with the apparent changes that occur in the social dimension of schizophrenia. That is, not only feeling suspicious of other people, perhaps due to an inability of reading their mental states, but also feeling somehow ontologically separate or different from other people, as reflected by the last one of the patient accounts. Ultimately, the attention schema is perhaps the common substrate that links self and other, a kind of umbilical cord, a psychic umbilical cord, if you will. If it is destroyed, then one would indeed feel ontologically different from others, as though, indeed, one were a kind of alien. So, to sort of, close all of this together and motivate a concrete direction for future research, I suggested we should perhaps test for possible links between social isolation, the phenomenology of self-disturbance, and other neurological and cognitive deficits such as aberrant salience and source monitoring error. Thankfully, researchers like Dr. Barnaby Nelson are already testing for causal relationships between the latter two variables. My suggestion to him is only that we should perhaps include social isolation among the potential risk factors that we consider. We should consider furthermore whether it accelerates self-disturbance. Likewise, I wonder if social interaction might in fact reverse the progress of self-disturbance in prodromal patients. Both possibilities, I think, are consistent with AST. The one final caveat that I might add here is that perhaps all forms of social interaction are not equivalent. For example, saying good morning to a cashier requires significantly less mentalization than gossiping with a close friend about another friend's annoying delusional habits. Indeed, the kind of recursive mentalization implicit in gossip implies not just banal social interaction, but a deeper sense of group membership. This perception of group membership and the recursive mentalization therein is perhaps simulated in TV sitcoms such as Friends, where the audience has to know that Rachel knows, that Joey knows, and Monica doesn't know XYZ thing. So, as silly as this might sound, could TV shows such as Friends serve as mentalization exercise for patients in the prodromal period of schizophrenia? This is a wildly speculative suggestion, but also hopefully an entertaining and light one, and therefore maybe a good place to end this video. So, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this.